Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this evening. I think that one of the interesting things of some of these this particular kind of conversation is that, and as the title of the book suggests, Beyond Binaries, is that we look at aspects of China beyond how we generally see it in our mainstream media and in our experience of having watched the country historically and the historical narrative that we have within India. Before I get to that, I want to ask a question to the audience, and if please raise your hand and let me know. How many people here have traveled to China? Okay, so that's 3 in this entire audience. So that's really interesting, right? And I also want to have one more question before I stop this poll taking. How many people have a positive view of China as a country? Okay, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people. Okay, 5 people have a positive view amongst us. So majority has not traveled to China and majority has a negative view of China. And 2 people who've not traveled to China also have a positive view of the country. Okay, so that gives us a little bit of a frame of what I hope at the end of this conversation, perhaps we've changed or improved, regressed, however, right? But perhaps hopefully this conversation leaves all of us a little bit better informed. Mr. Ramachandran, I want to begin by asking you about your experience first time visiting China. You begin the book by talking about traveling to the country in 2008, which is also one of the years where I had traveled to China, just before the Beijing Olympics. And it was a fascinating experience for me too, and I sort of resonate with some of the things that you've talked about, the development that you experience that hits you in the face as you enter the country. And of course, that's 16 years ago, so that's a long time ago. So I want to first ask you to just take us through what it looked like as a country to you and as a society to you when you landed in China in 2008.
It's on. Thank you, Manoj. Good to see all of you here. It's a very interesting question because we all grew up feeding on a lot of developments in China. We are the generation that heard people say China's chairman is our chairman, Nakshalbari and all that. And we were very fascinated. We used to get very angry when this whole power struggle was there and people referred to Jiang Qing as Mao's widow. We said, what is this thing of calling somebody Mao's widow? We would go to seminars where people use these terms and raise objections. And we tried to read Joseph Needham. It's not possible to read him in entirety of his work, but a lot of it on science and civilization, a number of things like that. But so one did think, okay, where else should one go in life? So places to go, the first and most important place to go, which I've still not been, is Fidel Castro's Cuba. When I go to Cuba, it will never ever be Fidel Castro's Cuba. The second place to go was to China. And we all wanted to go to Mao's China. We never got to Mao's China. The other place to go was Ho Chi Minh's Vietnam. And then, of course, one wanted to go to Palestine as well. Other things like Pele's Brazil and all came much later. So the image of China was people kind of a serried array in gray and black on bicycles and all going to work. So one said, maybe it's pretty dull for all this revolutionary thing, or maybe the films don't show all. But when I went to China in 2008, I was really, really excited. And as a journalist, and there are journalists here who would also know this, is that often when you go to a foreign country, you see somebody reporting from there who goes with a prime minister or a foreign minister or a president, then there is only the dateline that has changed. Instead of New Delhi or Bangalore, it might be Singapore or New York or Beijing. But 9 times out of 10, the journalist has not stepped out of the hotel or the briefing room in the hotel. But I had decided that I will step out from the minute that I land there, and I'm not going to be cooped up in the hotel except for the briefing. Fortunately, there were one-day holiday also in between, and I didn't have to file a report for my newspaper, the Tribune. And for some reason, I was invited and assigned by my newspaper to go with Manmohan Singh to China. On a couple of earlier occasions, I had declined to travel with union ministers because I felt it's just a change of dateline. It's not going to teach me anything if I go to the Philippines, can't go to any of the many islands there. So going to China, when I landed there, I was really shocked out of my wits because There was no black and gray and bicycles and things like that. You know, this whole range of cars, the automobilization of Beijing, and this skyscrapers that were coming up, this huge wide road. You require 3 to 4 minutes to cross a road when there's a green light. It's so wide. I've never seen such wide roads anywhere in India. And it is not just at one place. And the traffic. And they were building whole days and nights, ceaseless hammer, and all those cranes that are illuminated and construction the night. It was as if they had to finish building everything tomorrow or the next day. And when I was in New York, I never slept because New York is a city that never sleeps. When I went to Beijing in 2008, I think Beijing was also a city that never slept. So I too didn't sleep on most of my nights in Beijing. I went around to wherever I could. And because the Olympics was coming, I went in January, the Olympics was in August, I think. There were a lot of taxi drivers who were speaking English. Then one could still travel by the metro. And I was staying in the heart of the town in Wangfujing, where you have the, is it the Hyatt or the Hilton, one of those hotels where I was staying. And I saw these malls and brands and everything. I really couldn't believe that when we associate so many of these brands with being for brands or fake brands or whatever, that they actually had all these pricey things there. And at that time I was told there were more than 1,000 five-star hotels in Beijing. I couldn't believe it. They had 3 Hiltons and 3 Marriott hotels and so on. And we always thought that China didn't have those things, you know. And Beijing was, of course, very, very American with all the McDonald's. The McDonald's was full all the time. And I would find, that night I went to a McDonald's. It was at about 1:30 or 2. There were a lot of people sleeping inside. So then after a point, that guy said, you can't go, there's no space. That's because many people who come from outside Beijing, they kind of come to this McDonald's just before it closes. They order enough food and they sit there with their laptops and they have no other place to go. So they sleep there. So all these things, this reminded me of the poorer quarters of the US actually, although the facial characteristics of the people occupying the McDonald's was very different. I mean, it really didn't let me sleep for the 4 or 5 days I was there.
Yeah. I'm fascinated because you started with, in the book, you start with this experience of being in China, observing all this change that's happened. And of course, this rupture of your sense of China as backward. I'm glad you didn't go to Mao's China. It was not a good place. Just a sense of how the country has changed, right? And you write in the book saying that, you know, you felt that development is something that others can also achieve. And you define development as another word for infrastructure. And you say that it was an eye-opener to how much of the developed is achievable at development in a developing country. I want to sort of pose a slightly tricky question at this point. That development of China did have a demonstration effect for the rest of the world, including India. I mean, I remember Manmohan Singh going to Bombay soon after he won the election in 2004, or at least soon after he became prime minister, and saying something like, I want to make Mumbai into the next Shanghai. Not New York, not London, Shanghai. So there was this demonstration effect that, and there still exists today for a lot of countries because they feel that if China can, so can we. Yet the development model created a lot of problems, you know, from environmental pollution, inequality, deep corruption, so on and so forth. India seems to be, and in the book you talk about how India can learn and pick and choose aspects from China and its development. India seems to be in some ways doing the same infrastructure. And we've got malls, we've got the same things. I mean, you can walk in and buy the highest ends of brands in malls in India. Where is it that China its development model has switched? And has it switched? Or is it that these challenges are, you know, the glitz of the malls sort of deny us from actually looking at those challenges? Because in India, we do look at those challenges right now.
Actually, all my life, I've been a critic of this model of development. I've followed a lot of people like Wolfgang Sachs and all those people, you know, and those who led the Zapatista movement in Mexico and so on, who have been critics of this model of industrialized development, where everybody has concrete structures, you know, glass windows, and you have flush toilets in your house. And India has also been following that model. All these things require a lot of investable surpluses which has to come from other countries. And when we live like that, often it makes us forget that I think less than 15 or 20% of the water on earth is potable. So you can imagine how many millions or hundreds of millions are without potable water. There are, I mean, large tracts of continent without water. But when you see China and India, you don't feel that there is an acute water scarcity. But if having a flat with 2 bedrooms or 4 bedrooms or even 6 bedrooms, inequality, disparity, but having water, rich, poor, having a toilet where you can flush as many times as you want, this model of concretized development, it is China which has proved that even with a population of, say it was less than 1 billion then, we can get it for our people. Because I think even the political class realizes that whether this is an ideal developmental model or not, whether it is feasible in the long run, whether it is sustainable or not, and it will perpetuate inequality year after year, it will not reduce inequality, because that is aspirational. It is something akin to all the developing countries. The poorer the country, the greater the ambition to have a nuclear weapon, the greater the ambition to have a space mission. How many developed countries, perhaps with the exception of US and France, have space missions, and Russia, of course, which is on this side. So similarly, this model of development is something that we have been conditioned into believing, and it has become an article of faith. That is why I have not endorsed it. I have quoted Gilbert Rist, who said, and the only redeeming feature of this model of development, even in India, is that it is extremely secularizing. It kind of wipes out inequalities that are atavistic. Caste and ethnicity and religion, all other divides and prejudices, are overcome by this glass and concrete and these kind of, 2, 3 multiple bedrooms and flush toilets that you have. So eventually that becomes a new definition of both class and status.
Yeah, indeed, and that's the thing, right? There's a certain positive, and again, I'm it is easy for.
Sorry, I want to. So what China has done, it has demonstrated that this is possible. There is a great cost, as you said. Otherwise, till then, it is only in Europe that I saw everybody living in built-up structures, And in China, I didn't see, there are no temporary structures in which people are living. Yeah. Even in southern India, you don't see. I think most of the southern states have got above that level of poverty. Everybody, there are pakka houses only. But there are still vast areas where you don't have that. Yeah. But for me, it was astonishing to see that China, for instance, if you walk down a corridor, the lights switch off when you moved on. I had seen this only in Europe. I had not seen this in any of the developing countries I had been to, And in China, it was there. And there are 24 floors. There's water. Not a single day of the many times I stayed there was there ever a power cut, water supply cut, or let us say strikes, which is all a middle class dream of leading an acquisitive life and pursuing your happiness or wealth or whatever it is.
Yeah, which is what I wanted to ask about next, which is that if we define development and potentially becoming developed within this narrow concretized model, does it reduce everything to a very, does it reduce governance and existence and life to a very utilitarian, limited perspective? If the goal of human life is to be able to achieve these notches on your belt, that you are able to have 24. I mean, again, I'm saying this with the full acknowledgement of the privilege that thankfully I have 24/7 supply of water, I have 24/7 supply of electricity and backup and all of that. So I recognize that privilege. But isn't the fulfillment of human life and therefore also the responsibility of the state to some degree greater than that in terms of individual thought, freedom of ideas, freedom of expression? And to that degree, what was your experience in China?
No, it doesn't actually. But this is now a universal aspiration. When you say universal aspiration, maybe those who have attained this level of development, like capitalism is, as we see today, the highest form of development that we know in the present model. So now, when I last traveled to Germany more than 7-8 years ago, in Europe, they are building housing societies where they say, you can't own a car, you can't own any motorized vehicle. And if you say you have it, but you won't bring it in there, they said no. If you own one, it will come in there. So you declare it. And don't say you will leave it at the railway station. No. You stay in this place, you should not be owning one. It will never be allowed into the place. Because, of course, they have a different system. It's not as if you will have an emergency and an ambulance will not be available. It would be available. So even those choices of opting out are available only in those societies where this architecture of development is there in a generic sense, even if it is not privately owned by all those who are there. So, but for the developing countries, this remains an aspiration. We cannot convince people who are buying refrigerators today, oh, you can't buy a refrigerator, it will create fluorocarbon, CFCs. No. In my society where I live in New Delhi, there are 1,350 flats. I have been now living there for 23 years. I am seeing car cleaners who have bought cars. In my society, even the 1,350, every day there is a new car registering for a label. And I wonder why they get these Mercedes-Benz and that new one which comes, Morris garages. Yeah. They have to go behind that e-rickshaw or that auto rickshaw in that narrow road. It doesn't make sense to me why somebody would buy a car worth 50 lakhs or 80 lakhs. It does not alter your life. It makes sense to buy that car in Germany. It makes sense to buy that car in Beijing because it's a dream to drive on the autostradas of Italy or autobahns of Germany or the highways of Beijing. But that is not the case in the Indian cities, you know. So all that it does, as you say, it kind of deepens inequalities. But this is a dream that will not be shattered, you know. You cannot kill this dream ever. The techniques, technologies, and the outcomes of this dream might change. But the dream itself, the aspiration itself, will not change. It is like when you go abroad, before you go to a foreign country, it doesn't mean all of us. A lot of people from Kerala, when they first went to the Gulf, they swam out to the, rough seas. They boarded crude boats. They went part of the way. I've heard stories of people who swam 8 miles and 11 miles to reach the Gulf and find their job. I mean, all these things happen. But despite all this, there is a gap between how you imagine a place and what you aspire to. Till you reach there, I think all these lights of development tend to ensnare you. Only when you, and eventually you accept it. I used to come to Bangalore. I used to love coming to Bangalore. It cost only less than 6 rupees from Madras to Bangalore. We used to come here to have beer and go back because there was prohibition in Tamil Nadu. Because it was a garden city. People came here because you could walk, you could go to Kaban Park, you could go to Lal Bagh, you could sit around Ulsur Lake. Now when I come in the last 15, 20 years, Shastri, it is not like before. No. You get out of your air-conditioned bedroom, get into your air-conditioned car, go to your air-conditioned office, keep a good large car because you have to spend a lot of time in the traffic. Still people come to Bangalore. It is still considered a paradise in a different way. I wonder why.
As somebody who migrated from Delhi to Bangalore, at least till this summer began, the weather was a big attraction. I want to sort of further probe this idea of, because my question was in terms of the experience of society and whether there was a sense, because in 2008, 2009, around that time also, because of this rapid development in China and, there was also there was a certain moral vacuum, right, which the party seemed to have ceded ideology in many ways. And you had a lot of, and you talk about some of this in your book, where you talk about, a lot of these cults, religious gurus coming up in China also, which is again something that we and China have in common, where there were lots of these cults that came up. A lot of them have been taken down by the police in the last decade or so. But there was a sense of moral vacuum, where what do you sort of moor your life to, particularly because a lot of these individuals were single children, who didn't have siblings, who are suddenly caught in this urban thrall, and chasing life, like you say. What was your experience at that point in time of society, the outlook of youth, and in your last exchanges with people in that country, how has that changed?
No, in the last 15 years, I've also seen a lot of changes. From when I first went in 2008 till when I went last in 2020, which was my visit to Tibet. The one big thing that has changed is that the number of people who are wanting to go out has increased. And there is a great demand for Chinese mental and intellectual workers. For instance, I'm really surprised why India is missing out on the benefit of these. We have a lot of Indians. When I first went to China, there were probably 300-400 Indians there. During my last visit, there were more than 30,000 of them. And there were guys who were working with me, young chaps in their 20s who were working in Global Times in China Daily. I used to feel sorry. They are so bright. They have read so much. They're as good as any guy who comes and talks about business from Harvard and everything. But these guys are quiet at home. They are like Bahurupi, what do you say? They are multifaceted in the sense you will see only a facet of theirs when they are in China. They say, in China to succeed, you have to keep our mouth shut, your head down, and do this work. And then you find something where you get to Harvard or Canada or wherever it is, and you do what you want to do there. But you come back home, you have to be Chinese, you accept the supremacy of the party, don't make any unnecessary noises, and get on with your life. So this has increased. And many things in Beijing are very Americanized. Unlike Shanghai, which is more European, that goes back to a time when there was a lot of movement and traffic of populations, whole of East Asia and Europe, especially the colonizing countries like the French, the Dutch, and the English, who all passed through these great, historical crossroads. But other than that, now, Beijing, you can say, is probably Asia's greatest global city. Probably the greatest global city in the world, I would say, with the exception of places like New York or London or Paris. There is no other city I can think of where you will get almost practically every cuisine that you have in the world, where almost every nationality in the world is represented, and which was also, till Xi Jinping's second term, probably the most permissive society. Even during the years of the hippie cult, I don't think there was so much permissiveness rampant as it was in China. But the young people themselves seem to have put these aside. But as you said, because of this model, you have two types of people. There is those who want to get out. And there are people who are saving up $300,000, $100,000 to get what they call that e-card or something to go to the US. And the Americans have a lot of people there who are recruiting these Chinese actively. The second thing is, the other side is, a lot of people have moved away from this development. They are called Maoists, and you must have read about this. These are the people who feel that China is a rogue capitalist nation. And this kind of rogue capitalism has created a lot of black holes, and which is true. There are enormous black holes. There are a lot of social malaise in China, and crime is rampant. And addiction to internet, you have these real brutish schools of reform for children who are addicted to the internet. It's inconceivable the kind of suffering and deprivation they are subjected to make them break with this. It is worse than the kind of things that one has read of in Soviet Union, of the people being taken to Siberia to punish them and get them out of certain addictions and so on. And right in the heart of Beijing, there was a place when I was there where they found that some criminal businessman had employed more than 200 people who were mentally ill, or one can say not adequately developed, who were chained and being used as labor for several hours a day, and they were being fed along with the dogs that were kept. And this has gone viral all over the world. That something like this could be there in the heart of Beijing, which is so densely populated. It was inconceivable. People couldn't believe it. And one could see people gathering at that place. So you have all these black holes. The second thing is crime. Crime is huge. It's not only in fiction that one reads about Chinese crime. So it used to be said, with a bit of ironical humor, that when you say that President Hu Jintao has brought about harmonious development, yes, keeping all the Chinese at home is harmonious development for a lot of Asia. Why? Because you had these very much feared triads, the Chinese mafia, For instance, in Malaysia, you had the Chinese mafia, you had a Tamil mafia, you had other mafias too. And same thing in Singapore. When I met the Malaysian tourism minister, I asked him, this Tamil mafia and Chinese. He says, yes, yes, we need them. You know, our police and security alone cannot handle these things. You don't know these small, small gullies, what crimes gone. We need those people to control. And all of you who are of a certain age here must have read reports of how Chinese criminals used to go into Hong Kong, raid those banks, and walk away with cash to mainland China. And this stopped somewhat after the coming up of that overnight city, Shenzhen, and so on. This is so you've had, and then you have this port of Xiamen, where actually when I went in 2008, I was told it still happened, that when ships come in and smuggle goods, if you were the one smuggling it in, then you went and you invited all the officials of the customs and those officials of what do you call them, those stevedores and all of them, and you had a party where you sat facing the sea and they all sat facing away from the sea. And those ships sailed while you were drinking and eating. And I've never seen anybody drinking, not even in Kerala, like the way the Chinese drink. All alcohol, average alcohol is 65%, proof. Mostly it is 32, 37, 42, but 65, this. And then, I think till recently, till maybe 5 years ago, and they serve drinks without water. You drink this hard liquor with wine or beer, and they don't, like if they open a bottle of hard liquor, they don't pour it in small pegs or large pegs like we do. They'll have 4 glasses, they will empty it out into 4 glasses. And you finish it and call for, they leave a whole jug, and they will leave a small carafe next to you, and you pour it. And then if you're sitting at a party, and I'm now terrified of these parties because even if I take a sip with each of the guests with whom I have to raise a toast, I think I'll die, my liver will collapse. It's really there. And in China, actually, there was a rule that when people died of drinking alcohol at official parties, they were declared martyrs. And they were honored by the authority where they were. This was bad research. So, and producing this kind of alcohol, more and more expensive local varieties, was also considered a kind of a crime that when there's. So you had crime at home, and when I mentioned Xiamen, Xiamen is a port in the province of Fujian. I thought those stories were over in 2008. No. When you had the World Cup in South Africa, there were several thousand Chinese who went there. And you could see another example of you had those vuvuzelas. Any of you remember the World Cup football? Those long things like a Nalaswaram. They were produced for less than a yuan in China. And they were all selling for $8 there, So it was produced for 30 cents, 1/3 of a yuan it was produced. And at the same time, with all these goods, went several hundred Chinese businessmen with wads of money, and they wanted to open bank accounts in South Africa. The banks turned them away because increasingly the international rule is you can't deposit cash in an account. Earlier you had to deposit cash to open an account. Today you first open an account and then fund it. And you can only, to fund it, you have to show from where the money has come. It has to be wired from somewhere or transferred some. So the money that was carried was, they could not open these accounts. So you can see. And then in China itself, you will see people, he'll park his car here, he's carrying cash like this and walking to the bank. They buy cars with cash. They pay full cash down for an apartment. So these are all unthinkable for me in a developing country because they underscore that the more the development, the greater the inequality, a new kind of developmental inequality that is arising. So these black holes are quite fearsome. So that has given rise to the so-called Maoists, the new Maoists who are opposed to this, who still feel that Mao, it's some of the principles of Mao, they don't want to go, but they don't want this rogue capitalism, this total imitation of Western capitalism and this development model. And one of the persons who represented this, which is that Chongqing mayor, Bo Xilai. And see, that's another difference I noticed. I worked in the Global Times when Hillary Clinton was campaigning for internet as the fifth freedom. It was an unrelenting campaign carried on for more than a year, but the Chinese didn't budge, And I was not particularly even personally sympathetic to it because Google was doing good business in China. They were carrying the maps which the Chinese wanted them to carry. Only as long as they were getting business in China, they had no issues with it. It was only later when it became bad for business that Google made it an issue, and then they started carrying the maps the way India is depicted by Indian authorities. Till then, they had not done that. So at the same time, Bo Xilai was rising as a phenomenon. And Chongqing was a city of what? 3.5 crore people. And he was a mayor. You can't run a city of 35, 36 million, unofficial population, through what you call forces of law and order. You had to have a heavy hand. And he ran it, and he became so powerful. When he used to come for parliament sessions, all the journalists standing there used to cheer him from the moment he got down from his car till he went into the Great Hall, and they were there till he left. He was a cult figure. He was a threat, but he also supported these Maoists. And when he was arrested, there was no support on Chinese, internet for Hillary Clinton. But when Bo Xilai was arrested, that's one single day, there were more than 7 million microblogs that exploded worldwide on the web. So, which also made me wonder, yes, the Chinese will rise to overthrow something. They might. If they feel it is going to change things for better. They are not going to overthrow something because Hillary Clinton wants, or the militaries of the West, firing from India's shoulder, want to do that. No, the Chinese will change on their terms when they want to change. This is, I think, one of the few conclusions I am willing to make about China and the Chinese.
Yeah. Interesting you talked about Bo Xilai. Before I come back to the question on Bo Xilai, because I also had the experience of his trial, which was there. If anybody has any questions or thoughts, because we'll do a little bit on talking about what's happening inside the country and what the country is like, and then we'll come to India and China. But if anybody has any thoughts, questions, something that you want to clarify, please raise your hand and let me know so that I can come to you. Yes, please, sir.
Either of you, would you like to share something about Tibet? Because that's one place where I really wanted to visit. By the way, I have lived in China. I was working in China. So I traveled extensively in China. But obviously, my dream of visiting Tibet could not materialize. So if any one of you have visited or know something which is inside the story, I would like to know.
Would you want to talk about Tibet?
Yes, I'm not an expert on Tibet. I've been writing on Tibet, and I've been fascinated by Tibet. And before I went to China, I wanted to do a project for the Asia Society in New York on Tibet as the world's only republic without a state, because Tibet has survived as a cultural nation. It's more in the imagination. And that is also, the CIA did hire people, the US Defense Intelligence Agency and Pentagon, they did try training people in weapons and everything on the borders of Nepal and have guerrillas sent into China. None of these things worked in the 60s and the 70s. And so Tibetans now, there are people who felt the Dalai Lama can go back, will have a life there. Then you have other young Tibetans in India who say, no, we have to just go to the West and make our own life. There is no hope of struggling against this. So I have followed the Dalai Lama closely. I have been associated with some of the things. I admire some of his qualities and the way he has worked. And I have also traveled to Tibet. I was very fortunate to be able to go. And in 2020, I decided when they called me that, I've traveled, I don't want to spend 3 out of 7 days every trip in Beijing. I've seen enough of Beijing. They said, no, but this time we are going to Tibet. So in my mind, I still cannot accept Tibet as a part of China. I'm not saying this in terms of geopolitical terms. I'm saying this just like many Indians find it difficult to accept the Northeast as part of India. I cannot reconcile myself to Tibet being a Sinicized society, totally kind of suffused with all things Chinese. No. But it is geopolitically a part of China. It is Chinese territory. Now, Tibet. Today, you go to that Potala Palace, there are hundreds of thousands. The last count was it had 37 million tourists, and most of them are Chinese. They take allow Nepalese Indians by invitation, but no Westerners are there. A few people were allowed or have gone on invitation, written books and so on. And Tibet again is it's one of the most remarkable development landmarks in the world. I don't think any other place with the kind of topography that Tibet has could have been developed at that pace by anybody other than a China, which has the values of what I would call not only the industrial revolution, but also the Protestantism that made the industrial development of the West possible. Both these ethics are involved in this. And so you have these two things which are you go to the Potala Palace, you have people who are 70, 80, 90, they have come and they are there, kowtowing and hitting their heads on the floor in front of the temple. Not one, not two, not 100. I stand there for 5 hours and I can see non-stop people doing a parikrama of the temple and this thing. And on the other hand, you have the development of Tibet. As we go on these new highways that are built on which not only planes can land, but even tanks can roll. And you have these roads, you have these railway lines being built across the mountains. And I can hear the gurgle of the Brahmaputra river, which is there. And I have felt the power of the Brahmaputra river when I was in Nepal. I mean, if you are walking on a bridge, I used to be literally scared my hearing aid would get blown off. I had to tie it around. That is the force of the wind, stirred by the currents of the river. And you can see them at several 100 feet above that, cutting and building a track in the mountains. And now they have come up to Shigatse, which is less than 100 kilometers above Nepal, okay? And there is a bullet train running between Lhasa and Shigatse. So all these are for military purposes. Almost all development in the history of mankind are for war and maybe military. Development was not for our well-being necessarily. Incidentally, it has also made for our well-being. But the primary purpose of development was for the state to develop itself, its power, its authority, its ability to conquer and subordinate people, their subject people, as well as territories that they can conquer. And you find this is manifest in Tibet today. They are investing billions of dollars in this infrastructure. And you can drive for hundreds of miles. There is no habitation. You don't see a single whole day. From 3,000 feet, we have gone up to 5,500 feet. We didn't see a single human settlement on the way. They have built roads and tracks in these places, which means sooner or later, they will have to open up Tibet to the rest of the world, first thing. Second thing, that they will have to allow people to come and live there, or all this would be wasted. Either it will happen because the present order undergoes some kind of collapse or mutation, or because they will welcome it. The more interesting thing is that just as abandoned and deserted as the rest of Tibet is, in Lhasa, and even in Lhasa, just at the temple and the Potala Palace, there is not for a minute is that square outside the temple free of the thousands of people who are there. I spoke to a chap who works in the restaurant, and he told me in Hindi, I think all of you can follow. He said, "Unka naam nahi lena." You can ask me. So I asked him, he lived in Delhi, then he studied in Uttarakhand, in Dehradun, and he finished his degree from there. He said for 7 years he was in India, he could not find a job. So he's gone there. He said, I have a job, I have a house, my children get good education, but I'm not happy here. Our God is not here. Our king is not here. So the ultimate kind of deprivation for the Dalai Lama is for a God king being unable to go to his, what we might call karma bhumi. And this is also very painful for his people. So and we should remember that when the Dalai Lamas ruled over Tibet, it was not a paradise. No. They were some of the most feudally oppressive people in the world. They did not even feed their prisoners. Their prisoners were chained, and the chain was long enough for them to reach the thoroughfares outside the jail, and they were allowed to beg for food for a few hours a day. I mean, the tyranny of feudalism was so enormous, but that has not altogether shattered the faith of people in Tibetan Buddhism. No, the force of Buddhism is far, because maybe not all of them have a memory of that feudalism.
Yeah.
So this Tibet is probably one of the biggest paradoxes of our time.
Yeah.
Because-
Yeah, no, I agree. So unfortunately, I didn't have the opportunity to visit Tibet. I was not, as my bosses as CGTN at that point in time told me, you neither look white nor do you sound white, so you can't go. Which tells you a little bit about also the sense of, although my time at working in Chinese media was really fun, it was not journalism, but it was fun. There is an inherent racism, if I could call it, that exists within that ecosystem. It's not necessarily racism that exists in that context, but it's sort of racism linked to your nationality to a certain degree. It's strange, but my sort of sense on your answer on Tibet was really interesting and really revealing, because to me, it sort of dovetails into the point that I was trying to make earlier, which was that development is not just about engineering success. Roads, infrastructure, all that is tremendously important. And again, like I said, I'm talking from a position of privilege where I live in a city and I have access to things, whereas lots of Indians don't have access to that. But development is something deeper, right? That sense of deprivation of your ability to express yourself to the fullest, of things that you can't talk about, Like, I think that was really revealing when you said that guy said, unka naam mat lena. If you live in a society jahan pe aap unka naam nahi le sakte ho, where you can't talk about somebody or something, yes, the water is useful, it's already needed, it's necessary, but is that all what there is to life or should be to life? And should that be the goal of the state?
I'll add to this.
Is to just provide you that?
We have economic development.
Exactly.
But not the development for political freedom.
Exactly.
In other words, that is what this guy is telling.
Which is what I want to sort of come next. And I think you had a question. I'll come to you in a second. Because linked to this is the idea of journalism. And again, the only reason I make that point is because I think we shouldn't, as impressive as China's development is economically, I think it's truly important for us in India at this moment in particular to keep in mind that development has a broader definition. The shiny streets and shiny malls might not be what we eventually need for a fuller life. But anyway, I'll go to this point that you talked about. In your experience as a journalist in China, working with Chinese media, and I want to read this quote because I think it was fascinating. You write, if you are free of notions of journalism acquired elsewhere, carry out every wish of the Chinese bosses as your command and feel pleased and privileged to perform like a flea, then you can collect a tidy sum and live it up. I completely agree with you.
Actually, people would accuse me of writing about present-day conditions in most of Indian media.
I would agree with you on that also. But I do agree with you. The only difference would be you wouldn't necessarily get a tidy sum and live it up in India. So that would be the difference. But I wanted to get your experience of working in Chinese media. What was it like for you to have that experience, having worked as a journalist elsewhere?
So, there are a lot of young people there. So I had taken all my books, Jonathan Spence and Max Weber, sociology of religions and religions of China, And I found I didn't need any of it to write those editorials or comments. But there were a lot of these oldies there. People, I'm not to call anyone else an oldie, but there were people older than me at that time there. And this guy says, no, Aurobindo said this, Osho, Shankara said this. They have this whole philosophical grasp of this, of what Tagore said of one nature. But these guys are just supervising. So I said, but you people never raised any of these things at the meeting. They said, no, nobody is interested in these things. These are my books. I keep it in the shelf of mine in the office and along with my wine collection there, So he enjoys his wine, reads those tracts, and we sit and discuss that. But working in China, I think I worked there because of the experiences it offered me first. I've also told myself that as a journalist, if I am a journalist, I should learn to function in any conditions, anywhere. And that one can communicate the truth of any situation, provided you find the language and expression and the vehicle for that communication. I mean, we've all read everything that we knew about the Soviet Union, which was all written by Russians who were in the Soviet Union. How did they communicate this language? We've read all that we knew about an Iran under the tyranny of the Shah, which was written by Iranians, which was told to us by Iranian students who came to Bangalore and Hyderabad and Bombay. So there are these stories. So there is a way of telling these stories. But there is no society or no country which has only this black and dark holes. There is a bright spot too. Like one question which I ask, what is upholding the Chinese political authority, especially somebody like Hu Jintao, who was a liberal, and Wen Jiabao under him? Why do people put up with so much hardship and these limitations? So I've asked these questions to myself. And then I find that there is still a lot of space. Maybe today if I work in a newspaper like Deccan Herald, there might be only the editor or the management might say, this 10% of the area is a no-go area, okay? But in China, I noticed there is a huge difference. Now look at Global Times. How many people have heard of Global Times here? How many? Yeah, most people have heard of this paper. This paper came up in 2009. How many people have heard of China Daily? Okay. And China Daily has been there from 1983. That is the official paper. Global Times is a party, comes from the stable of the People's Daily, which is a party newspaper. But there is a buzz about Global Times because it was a marketing strategy that you bait people. Whatever publicity you get, there is no such thing as bad publicity. All publicity is good publicity, you know. So it is on that principle. And they have the best informed people. I have met their political commentator, Ding Gang, whom all the ambassadors, everybody used to meet for a briefing on what's going on in China. And he told me, no, Shastri, don't expect from these young people. This is a school. This is, you know, in India you say Shala, where they teach Sanskrit before in their teens, this place is like that. So you write, we teach them how to write English, how to put it in journalistic language. You don't expect them to provide the content. So I found young people are willing to learn how to write, you know. And in newspapers, they had an advantage which a large number of Chinese did not have. They had access to Google. They could read any Western newspaper that they wanted. There was no restriction. And then within the newspaper, I could discuss. So I found there are areas where one could write. And my second thing was that if I believe China is a developing country, as I believe it is, and India, and I also believe that there are more common interests than bilateral problems between the two countries, so I have to find what are these areas. For instance, the Bhopal gas leak. So, you know, some of you were not around when the Bhopal, some 26 years later, you get this court verdict sentencing people to 6 months in what is the worst case of industrial genocide after Minamata in Japan. And so the Chinese were appalled. They said, what is this? You say independent judiciary, what is this happening? So that time there was a G7 conference going on in Canada. So we had a discussion that day. I could make them discuss the editors, and the youngsters were told they can sit and listen to this. So I said, this is because developing countries don't stand together. So he said, what do you suggest? I said, if India and China together spoke up when these things happen, then we could perhaps make them pay for these kind of damages they do to the developing country. For instance, there was a British petroleum leak in the Gulf of Mexico. I think the US demanded $20 billion. Without a whimper, the British paid up. Why didn't Union Carbide pay India what it deserves to be paid? Because there was no... So I said, why should India and China together not raise these issues at the high tables of the G7? Why are they going to the G7 to discuss the financial crisis faced by the West? We should go there to deal with the crisis that our countries are facing, not to find solutions for their crisis. So these are issues one could raise these things. And these are issues for a long time I have felt as what one would call the G20 or the third world, which are very important for us as a viewpoint which needs to be articulated. They might not lead to solutions, but it means a diverse, like why debt should be written off of developing countries. These things you could. And as long as you did not personalized issues of saying, say, oh, Xi Jinping is a tyrant, you could still write a lot. You could write about hospitals, you could write about colleges and schools. There were possibilities for writing. And it gave me an opportunity to meet a lot of people. Like in Global Times, I was the only Asian who was not Chinese. I was the only foreigner who was not white. There were 28 Westerners. And they have this thing that, okay, only the white man can write English language, you know. So you have a lot of these guys who don't know journalism, but who are there because they know and they're fast learners, they've left home, and they get good money. And another quality the Chinese have, the person who's my boss, who's, let's say, deputy managing editor, would probably be your age. She's probably paid 1/5 or 1/6 my salary. I am paid 5-6 times her salary. But she's able to live with it. How many of us would be able to live as Indians by getting, say, people from another South Asian country here who would be paid more than us? You know, it would hurt our sense of, you know, supremacy. I also learned that the Chinese, like the Americans, have a sense of exceptionalism. You know, they feel we are Chinese. I mean, we are a people apart. We are a race apart. That is what he meant when he said race. They don't have pigment prejudice. No. The other thing I discovered as a journalist is a number of people coming to the office. It reminded me of my travels to the Soviet Union in the 70s and to the US. Just like the developing countries were taken and brainwashed without knowing that they were brainwashed by being taken to the factories and schools and colleges and party offices, whether it is the US or the Soviet Union. The new place of conditioning, brainwashing, or you might call it developing these minds, is China. There are 25,000 Peruvians in China. I don't know even if there are 25 of them in India. And there are people there from almost all the South American countries who are flourishing there. Every one of those countries has their restaurants, their New Year celebrations, their food festival. Why isn't it anywhere there else in Asia? So these are things I could discover only because I was a journalist. But I don't think I succeeded in all that I set out to do. For that, he must have read a lot of these books he might be having, and I strongly commend people to use a place like Takshashila. For instance, Peter Hessler's book, beginning with Oracle Bones. The Westerners have written some of the finest books on China. I wish it had been us who had done this, but no. And somebody is working as a clipping assistant in the New York Times. He just cuts things out of a newspaper and makes. But he learned Chinese. He looks at the CCTV, learns the language, and he's put together volumes of books which actually sell not hundreds, not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of copies worldwide. So, in a way, there is immense potential in China. The less we know about it, the greater the interest in wanting to know about it. And it is really sad that after 2020, they stopped teaching Mandarin in many schools as a matter of, what has language got to do with a conflict between the militaries of two states? You know, it's not a conflict of languages or people. So these are things that one learns when one is in China.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I mean, if I could just add a couple of...
also been in China as a journalist.
Yeah, I mean, if I could add a couple of more stories from, you know, working in China with Chinese state media. So the idea of pushing boundaries, I mean, but one example that I have is, and I can't remember the year, I think it was 2015, when the US Supreme Court ruled in favor of gay marriages in the US. In China, just before that, sometime homosexuality was thought of as a ailment, as a disease, as a mental health disorder, and then that sort of that was officially changed. And then in 2015, when the US Supreme Court ruled against this, ruled for gay marriages, we had, I was working with CGTN's digital team. The television channel, which is outwardly focused, CGTN is English, they covered the story as any other story, that this is what's happened. We were asked not to touch it because homosexuality is sensitive. Members of my team, very young Chinese, very interested in wanting to do something about it, wanting to push the boundary to get the conversation going. It was middle of sort of May, April, May, something like this, middle of summer. Strange day in Beijing, it rained in Beijing. There was a rainbow in the sky. So as most Chinese social media has is pictures of nature. They clicked a picture of the rainbow, and they put it up saying, maybe a sign, and Beijing has a lovely rainbow. And that sparked discussions on Sina Weibo about how, is the media sending us a signal? Of course it was not. It was 7 people sitting in a room randomly putting a picture of the rainbow, trying to be slightly subversive. And it prompted a discussion. And like you said, there are certain market norms that can dictate. So the fact that there was a conversation led to the deputy director of the channel saying, okay, let's try and explore this. So that can be a political risk for that person to try and explore something which is a no-go area. But we did explore it, and then we did a live conversation around homosexuality in China, which is how an example of how boundaries get pushed. On the flip side, you talked about the Bhopal gas tragedy and the verdict, and in developing countries standing together and all of that. And great sentiment, never really going to happen. Also, as much as that is something where a Chinese editor might give you freedom to write about, in my experience, again, I was sitting in my office in Beijing in the big Pant CCTV building. There was a gas explosion which we could see from our window at a distance, huge plumes of smoke. You can't talk about it. You can't talk about it for 24 hours until from Xinhua, which is the state council's agency, you get a message saying, so-and-so thing happened, firefighters are at the spot, situation is contained. So you report tragedies in China when the situation is contained. Otherwise, tragedies don't seem to occur.
Suppression of day-to-day news.
Exactly. So you will find this dichotomy that exists over there, which to me, obviously, as a journalist, is very difficult to deal with. But also, I think that from a perception of the media with the public, it can be quite challenging. So just a couple of stories of how things can function. But I'll come to your question now.
Sir, what do you think is the purpose of China's development? Is it a strategy to shut people's mouth and hide a big political game that China is playing? Because on one side they talk about development and all that, and on the other side they have ethnic cleansing, human rights violation, and the way they handle lockdown situation, there were protests by the people. So what is the purpose of China's development? That is my first question. And my second question is, you were talking about how information is kind of open to people, and there are areas where journalists can talk. But I'm working on Indian and Chinese diaspora as part of my research. What I got to know from Indian diaspora there is that they feel very secure in China because people there are not aware of what's happening in the border area. So they're not informed about what China is doing, its expansionist policy on day-to-day basis. So what is this whole thing?
I will take your second question first. How many of us are aware of what's happening in our border areas with China? Please tell me. Does anybody till today, in 4 years after it happened, know the truth of what happened in Galwan? Have the Chinese come in or not? Okay?
The Chinese have come in.
Eh?
The Chinese have come in.
Yeah, they have.
There is clear data to tell that.
They have. So these are all presumptions, but there is nothing on record. The Prime Minister keeps saying, nobody has come in, nobody has occupied an inch of her. More interesting thing is not only the Prime Minister, the Lieutenant Governor of Ladakh, who's a brigadier, Mishra somebody, he has said they have not come in. Okay. Let me take the argument that they have not come in and occupied. They have only moved their patrolling points further so that our patrolling. In which case, what is all this campaign against the Chinese about? Because there is no dip in India-China trade. Trade has crossed $130 billion, which was a dream of Manmohan Singh. They said we'll touch $100 billion in 10 years. It's happening only after the hostilities against China have been raised to this pitch. 35 of your aircraft are leased from Chinese leasing companies. So some of and all these things of shutting down TikTok and all that, it's not hurt the Chinese. I don't know if there's such a place in Bangalore, but in Delhi and Connaught Place, there used to be a street. There were hundreds of young people like you who were shooting these things. So shutting down TikTok has hurt only the Indians who are this thing, making money out of this. Now this year, China has announced 101,80,000 visas for Indians. So I told a businessman friend who leads the delegation for technology and buying every year, he says, no, what good is it to us? I said, why do you say that? He says, there are no flights. All this money will go to the Western Airlines, Cathay Pacific, and all that. So the fact is that when it comes to reasons of state, whether a country is a democracy or a dictatorship, the truth is seldom known the way it should be known. First, it doesn't matter. Second thing you say, so when it comes to what we should know, there is a lot of things that are suppressed. Not everything the state tells us. Even in China, nobody has to tell him you can't report those plumes coming out. He knows it's futile to try to report those things. In India also,
Which is
there are
worse.
people- huh?
Which is worse.
Yeah,
which is
yes,
worse. I
yes.
mean, in India, I can still make the case that I
Yes.
want to report about
Yes,
those plumes,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
perhaps I will end up in some
Yes,
trouble.
yes.
I might lose my job.
Yes.
And I keep saying this. That, the challenges might be the same. At the end of the day, in democracies, it might be a question of your career.
Yes.
In dictatorships, it's a question about
Yes.
your life.
Yeah.
And that's a huge difference.
Yes. Second thing, when you say about human rights violations, I feel that, please tell me, whether one looks at human rights violations with specific to a country, or is it one applies certain universal values? How much of the so-called international community, which raise, and who are this international community? 5% of these white people, They are the international community who speak about human rights in China. Where is the same, even lip service to human rights when it comes to the genocide in Gaza? Please tell me. Not a single Indian media runs like Al Jazeera, genocide in Gaza. Why? We are so conditioned, and our interests are so deeply tied to Western investments, and our newspapers and advertisements and everything. I might want to write about it. We can talk, as I was telling him. In Kerala, there are 400 people who gather to discuss Palestine. A lot of people, but you look at what is happening. And yesterday, in my newsroom, I had to correct in every copy, Iran attack to Iran retaliation. Iran did not attack Israel. Israel mounted the attack. And people are so ignorant of history. During World War I, World War II, never in 100 years has a diplomatic mission ever been bombed during any conflict. The only time it happened was by mistake, when Bill Clinton was the president, and during the continuous bombing of Belgrade, after the breakup of Yugoslavia, for 70 days they were bombed. Some of the bombs destroyed the Chinese embassy. They said it was a mistake. They expressed regret. They offered reparations privately, but China refused to accept it. There was no other than that. But nobody felt so outraged when Israel bombed a diplomatic mission, which has never happened in any war. And for instance, you look at the reporting in India, every time you report the Hezbollah, you will say Iran-backed Hezbollah. Never is it said the US and NATO backed Israel. Why? Every time we report Putin, we say the former KGB chief. Do any of you ever read anywhere of Bush being called the former CIA chief? No. So we have to, one is we have associated human rights with the West. Personally, I agree with you. Today, after living in China, I know what the restrictions are. So maybe he or I, we know how to negotiate our way. And when it comes to survival, we can. So we would probably be equally comfortable because we are highly evolved as professionals. But otherwise, the average person, for him, there is probably more human rights in the West. But then we don't have 1 crore of Indians in the West. We have more than 1 crore Indians in the Gulf, where there are no human rights at all. And we are celebrating some tyranny in the Arab world because they have put up some Swaminarayan temple. Why? So, see, this is also founded on tyranny, but we are not able to see those things. So it's also, I agree with you, we should raise human rights in China. We should also raise the issue of women's rights in Afghanistan. That it has affected only 8 or 10 or 15% of the population is not an issue for not raising it. But by the same logic, you have to speak of why did the remaining 85% of people in Afghanistan support the Taliban? They were not hiding in rat holes, Why did they come? Why did the world's most powerful army, which occupied Afghanistan for 20 years, what about the millions of people they have killed all over the world? Why is there no human rights education on the daily violations. It's a different matter that I personally, all of us have great regard for Obama, is an exceptional conduct, personal conduct. But the largest number of wars unleashed by the US was during the time of Obama. And the US, as a military-industrial complex, cannot sustain itself or its economy and its global power without continuously being at war. In spite of that logic, we don't raise that issue because there is a certain conditioning and there are certain global conditions which make us raise. So I would say yes, we should raise human rights in China, but not through the prism of Western nations. We'll have to find forums to do these things. Like the non-aligned movement was there,
So, thank you.
Yeah,
I mean, look, as a realist, for me, I agree. I mean, look, the world is amoral in many ways. I have no problem what people do with people in their own countries. My challenge is when it becomes an issue for India. And that is when I will sort of, I'm not an internationalist in that sense, right? So I'm a horrible person in that way. But on your point of Indians living in China, I don't think knowledge of the boundary conflict will make them more insecure. I don't think socially that hatred exists. That said, I think there is a change that's taken place. So when I lived in China, if you asked the ordinary Chinese, if you asked even people working in Chinese media at mainstream level, that there was a war between India and China in 1962, they had no recollection of it. Because it was not part of their public memory. But that has changed since 2017. And that has changed because of the Chinese media. In 2017, if you go back to Doklam, you will see absolutely vile, vitriolic coverage of India in the Chinese media. I mean, there was a infamous video by Xinhua Spark, which was a sort of their attempt at being youthful, and that caricatured a Sikh man, and with a Chinese person constantly saying things and the Sikh man constantly responding in slightly dumbfounded ways, and then the Chinese person saying, "Are you dumb that you don't understand this?" And that did, and that's just one example. There's another example of, say, the People's Daily reproducing its 1962 editorial. More recently, as part of Xi Jinping thought, in schools you have the lessons of Galwan being taught. And they have full right to do that. I'm not saying that they don't have full right to do that. We have full right to teach our lessons, and so do others. But it tells you a little bit about the change because there is permissibility to do this now, which there wasn't in the past. I don't think necessarily that still means that Indians in China will be insecure. I think they will be generally quite secure, just like anybody else, right? So that's my sort of short answer.
Manoj, I want to endorse what Manoj says here. And it's not only because it is real politics, that increasingly we take a position that if the people of China are happy with Xi Jinping, who are we to raise issues of? And the test is not whether a leader is acceptable to all people in a country. Edgar Snow, who wrote one of the first most readable books on China, Red Star Over China, he says the only measure of a political leadership is whether this leadership has done a few percentage points better than the previous leadership. So, compared to what the feudal states were, where people were dying in any case in thousands, that Mao killed 20 million people is not a big deal. As many would have perished even otherwise or more. But certain equalitarian order was there. So you measure in percentages. You can't have every section happy. Second thing, every state follows this logic because that is the only logic that works in real life. Who are the guys we are inviting for our Republic Day? Can you recall the Democrats we have invited? Who came last? That Egyptian dictator Sisi, who executed 400 people of the Muslim Brotherhood? Why? So where was human? So states have only interest. A state does not have human rights. These are societal, people, parliamentary concerns of the commons. The state does not. State concerns itself with territory, with sovereignty, and protecting its apparatus.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I am happy for us to raise issues of human rights as a realist also. because I want people in China to be unhappy with Xi Jinping. It keeps him occupied with other things than with us. So I want them to raise that. Also, I mean, at an individual level, I mean, when I spoke as a realist, I speak as a realist. As an individual, I mean, look, I think that, like I said, purpose of life is more than development. Purpose of life is also individual fulfillment and the opportunity to live to the fullest. And I don't think that can happen without freedom of thought. It can't happen in a society where you have, he who can't be named, right? So you can't live in that sort of a society and be fulfilled in some way or the other. Since we're running out of time, we have about 15, 20 minutes left, I want to come to the India-China bit, since we've already got to that bit a little bit. Why do you think we can't solve a boundary issue? Why do you think we can't solve a boundary issue? You said that in the book you write about 2015.
You can't solve the boundary issue because you have, take the case of Japan and Russia, the northern territories or the Kuril Islands. Till now, World War II is not yet over between Japan and Russia. Why? Because you have those slivers of dots of islands there, which is unresolved as to whom it belongs to. Neither country can afford to give it up, because this whole cultural nationalism, especially in a developing country, in India, for instance, the people who are most concerned about territory are the poor, not you and me. We don't have caste, we don't have country, we can go and flourish anywhere. But the poor, our land, our country's land. That is why the RSS is able to territorialize its nationalism, first thing. The second thing is that there is no recognition, we have no understanding of how people live on the border. I think very few of us have a real understanding. And attempts to develop this understanding have been scorched by India as well as China. There was a serious current of political, economic, and social inquiry, investigation, and study of what is known as sub-regionalism. And one of the laudable outcomes of this was this forum called Bangladesh, China, India, and Myanmar, BCIM. And it did progress. Why was it important? Because I was in Sikkim for a conference of sub-regionalism where people were there. I also attended Track 2 meetings on this thing. Track 2 is like demi-official. Officially, Government of India won't say these are our participants, but we would participate and we would give a feedback later to the observers. So, when I went to Sikkim, there was a speech by Pranab Mukherjee as foreign minister in parliament. He said, we want peace on the periphery for progress and development at the center, which means all these people on your borders are so much scapegoat or cattle to be sacrificed because you want development at the center. Now, what was common? People have done studies, and like for instance, Patricia Oberoi, she's done extraordinary work, this Australian woman who has done a lot of work on gender and sociology and everything. That if you look at the, just take Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, there will be areas where the people on the border have more in common with each other, regardless of being Tamil or Kannadiga, because that is their culture. That is a particular habitat. It might have been cut into Karnataka or Tamil Nadu. Similarly, there are people on the border of Bangladesh, India, China, and Myanmar who have a lot in common. Their agricultural seasons, practices, their clothes, their food, their festivals, their harvests, number of things. So, but these are not recognized in Delhi or Beijing or Rangoon. So this is one thing. So unless there is a recognition of what is a border is not a line. When Shyam Saran was the foreign secretary, there was once and only once an attempt to actually map the border on the ground, and that is not possible. Because the river will flow like this one season, another season it will flow like that. So whether it is Nepal or China, the border is something that is shifting like the sands of a desert. So you can't. Second thing is, there is no discussion of the border outside the framework of nationalism, sovereignty, or territorial integrity, which I think is an important development, which Putin and Abe did discuss for the first time, is why do you have to demarcate a border? Why can't there be joint development of a border? So they said that without stirring or tampering with nationalistic sentiment, let us discuss joint development of these territories. It may never happen in 20 years, but at least the conflict will settle down. There will be no conflict. But this has succeeded. Like you have the example of the island of Gotland between Sweden and Finland. You know, then you have, for instance, Copenhagen. That region is called the Malmö region. So you get down at Copenhagen airport, 15 minutes this way, you're in Malmö, 15 minutes this way, you're in Copenhagen. So people live in one country, work in another, and this happens in Alsace also, in the south west of Germany, where you have Strasbourg and all these places. People go regularly shop for food from France because cheese and wine is cheaper there than in Germany. So and they come to Germany for this. So unless one develops an interest in the border beyond militarization, because I don't know how safe it is or how much security do we get by any number of soldiers you have on the border. I don't know. There are other, so I think maybe we need to have different type of, if you don't find the solution, then you have to see why it is not. The second more important thing is, it was felt when Modi became Prime Minister and Xi Jinping was President. Both these are strong leaders. Nobody else had the support, so perhaps this is a time we could break through. This was also felt when Rajiv Gandhi went to Beijing because he had more than 400 seats. But both Rajiv Gandhi as well as Modi, they realized that it may not be acceptable to people at home. People at home means the political backlash. They will say, hey, he's given our land to China. What kind of a prime minister? He's finished politically, whoever does it. So until that climate changes, that is not possible. They won't discuss the boundary issue. And even the Chinese person, they had the special representative boundary talk. And Dai Bingguo, who was a Chinese counselor, he has written a book. He said, no, whatever had to be accomplished on that was accomplished during Vajpayee's time. After that, it has just become like a ministerial meeting. It's a waste of time. He said that very frankly. And when Vajpayee went, and they had said that why don't you just say that, Tibet is this thing and Taiwan in writing. So Vajpayee said, okay, I will write and give it. Then Brajesh Mishra, who was the National Security Advisor, he said, no, we cannot write and give these things. For instance, whenever an Indian Prime Minister goes to this thing, China, somewhere he will mention that Tibet is an inalienable part of China. We have accepted, we have no differences with China on the territorial integrity of it. But we will not write it and give it to them. It might be in a readout which are gone. So there's a lot of protocol involved, nationalistic sentiments, domestic political pressures, all these things decide border. It is not reason and practicality alone.
What stops China from being pragmatic and saying, all right, we'll settle it? China's given territory to other countries as part of settlements in the past. Why not accept the McMahon line? Why not say, okay, parts of Aksai Chin that you currently occupy, you keep, the rest of it we keep? Why not propose that sort of thing rather than necessarily doing what they're doing currently?
No, this is a cultural attribute of the Chinese. The Chinese have tended to be expansionist, with or without a military. They see the boundary as part of their territory and then it expands. And I think it needs a kind of a transformation, a mental transformation on both sides, one. The second thing is, there is a perception that India is not pitted against China for itself. It is pitted against China for the rest of the Western world. This perception is there because, and that's why in my book, one of the points I've said is, we should deal with China exactly as the US does, not as they ask us to do. Why do you let the US Defense Secretary come here and criticize China? No, we should not be allowing him the ground for that. We will criticize China on our turf when we want it. You see? And actually, Galwan, many people interpret that it's a big power game. What is China today? China is a rising power. How do you define a power? A power will say, I am a law unto myself. No laws apply to me. No international criminal court. No international court of justice. No United Nations. Nothing. My law is what I lay down. This is the US policy when it comes to a law. This is what China is doing in South China Sea. China is saying, we are a power. We will play it like other powers. And we will decide what is the law. And India is also doing that. None of these three countries who are quoting the international court have ever accepted rulings of the international court. They are only citing this now. But neither US nor India has ever accepted these. So this is big power game. And interestingly, he might know better than me. I don't track it so closely, but I'm sure somebody else there. All the reports that we have are only about Chinese military activities in the South China Sea. There is not a single report I have seen in the last 10 years about how much of militarized expansion has been by the US in this part of the world. I mean, in my younger days, I knew how many bases they had by heart. They had only 2 bases. They had Subic Naval Base and Clark Air Force Base. These were the only 2 around. But now there are many, many more. So what China has done in big power, it has, this is an argument, I don't know. There will be a lot of difference on it, on the part of experts. Political India would never accept this, that the attack in Galwan was to establish deterrence against India. Okay? Now, people who have reviewed my book, like Vivek Kadju, was Secretary MEA when he retired, he says, no, there is no evidence of it. But every foreign secretary I've asked, retired, is this establishment of deterrence against India or not? They said, we cannot say. But what it shows is that when you have a nuclear weapon, you think it is a deterrence. It has not deterred China from a military conflict of a different kind, first. Second, your foreign minister has said repeatedly, we cannot go to war against China. They are a much bigger economy. So what does it mean? They have deterred you from pursuing thoughts of conflict. Although our Navy is vastly superior, our Air Force superiority is not in doubt. So this is a big, and India is perceived as being not having any strategic autonomy in dealing with China, but is kind of guided by NATO and US and all these things.
Which is, we're just about out of time, but which is really interesting because it tells you how many of these kinds of conversations about what India thinks need to happen in China, because they clearly have got us wrong. If they assume that in 2019, 2020, India was thinking of conflict with China, clearly they didn't understand what India was doing. If they assume that India does not have autonomy, which I agree, there are lots of scholars and analysts in China who actually make the other case saying, look, you are wrong in thinking that India does not have autonomy. It actually acts relatively autonomously in many which ways. But the official zeitgeist seems to be
arguable.
the official zeitgeist seems to be that India doesn't have autonomy. And I mean, Vijay Gokhale has a paper where he makes this case that historically this has been China's blind spot when it comes to India, that they seem to look at us through red, white, and blue lenses rather than the tricolor Indian lenses. But I think there's a question there, right? Yes, please. We'll take those couple of questions and then we'll wrap up.
So I would like to ask you, India, in our perception, because this is a conversation on India and China, India, we don't think our nationhood would require us
Take the mic closer.
To hold the states together. I mean, there isn't very much of a risk of us falling apart if we don't keep them together and our binds are, in our opinion, strong enough. The Han Chinese, the entire China, it's a question one can always ask, is it really a nation? Because Xinjiang is hardly that.
Yeah.
Tibet and what they call their South Tibet, which is our Arunachal, is not part of them. You mentioned about our Northeast. We psychologically probably, many of us think they don't look like us or they're not people like us. Will China, in your opinion, People's Liberation Army, holds them all together?
Will China?
The PLA holds them all together.
Holds them together, and the way they run it is the army is all the party. And even in the border areas that we talk about, Galwan, it's people who have settled with families. We don't let our Madras regiment people go with family and settle and grow whatever curry patta leaves and live there, like the Chinese do. So they've got them all together under a very peculiar kind of situation. Do you think China, if it doesn't have this iron grip, will fall apart?
Do you think China, if it doesn't have this iron grip on its people, will it fall apart, given the fact that there is deep ethnic and linguistic and other differences.
No, I mentioned earlier that the Chinese one, like Western imperialism or colonialism, has been an expansionist culture. You know, they never went with gunpowder to many places. They went, but the Chinese expansionism has included a settler culture, and that is there throughout Asia. The way they have absorbed Manchuria, parts of Korea, and all those. So this expansionism is there. Territorial expansionism come with settler culture is part of that.
Yeah. I think we're out of time. If I can recommend a book for this particular conversation that you had, Bill Hayton has a book called The Invention of China. You can check that out. Okay, we'll take one last question and then we'll wrap up.
The people who have visited China, not like privileged two of you, they have reported back saying that the ordinary Chinese, they have got an aversion to Indians now, what you say. And the ordinary Indians, when they go for shopping and things like that, they have identified themselves as Sri Lankans to get over the backlash. That's one. Secondly, Arunachal Pradesh, China has named some of our parts with their own names. Now Galwan, whatever was the response which India gave, I don't think Chinese were ready for that. So we have taken the game to a different level altogether. Now, how do we deal with China, which, as you said, is expansionist in its attitude, historically and even now, and now they have become much more aggressive than any other time. And how do we deal with such a China and still hold onto our own ways?
Okay, that is, at Takshashila, we call that a Mahatma grade question because it is a deep policy question as to how do you deal with China. So I'll give you 1 minute to answer it.
See, almost all that you say is the perception here. That's what I would say. Unless you know what are the perceptions that side. And second thing, this debate is only among a class of people like us. Whether you are from the army, whether you are from the press, whether you are from the business or whatever, someone who has a kind of a worldview and is an internationalist of sorts in his thinking. The ordinary Indian who goes to China, the 30,000 people who work there for Microsoft or Anbax, they are not concerned with this. They say life is good, my wife is safe, my children can go out for birthday parties and come back at 2 a.m. Nobody will touch my wife. I have no fears of living here. I get my rice, I get my dal. So these are all concerns of what, let us say, even today, we'll all be accused of being a parasitic class who don't contribute to productivity, but we sit around discussing these things. So this is of course, you as a soldier are involved. So your perception of what? Mine is based on what I get as a journalist. So we have to rise beyond this and see how is it on the other side.
So since I straddle used to be a journalist, I'm a strategic affairs fellow right now, looks at China from a strategic point of view. Let me try and just address that. And I'll give myself also 1 minute, which is, we will have to continue to, firstly, domestically, internally, we will have to maintain social stability. We can't compete with a beast which is 5 times bigger than us and which has shown us hostile intent while being internally divided. That does not mean we need to be homogeneous internally. We need to have our arguments internally without vying for each other's blood. That's the first thing, which is the big challenge. The second thing is we need to continue to grow economically, and we need to find a way in which we use the fruits of that economic growth to not just build nice roads, but also invest in human capital. We've done that very, very poorly. We need to do that better.
Yes, I think this is the most important point, that China, whether you call it aggressiveness, theft or power war, it is primarily economic. And India is far, far behind China.
Thirdly, we need to continue to make common cause with partners in the West who are supporting us. In India, we have a lot of hesitations with the US. A lot of those are based in history, despite Prime Minister Modi saying we have gotten past hesitations of history. There are still lots of hesitations with the United States. In international relations, nobody trusts anybody. Interests are what matter. Today, the interests of the United States and India seem to align with each other, particularly when it comes to China. There are other differences that we have. Demonstrably, the US has been a good partner. At least the experience of Ladakh over the last 4 years tells us that. Demonstrably, Americans are shifting in terms of how they work with India. That does not mean it's a blanket relationship with everything works. But we will have to continue to work with partners because none of us can deal with China individually. At the same time, we cannot wish away geography. China will always remain our neighbor. Unless continental drift happens, that's going to take a long time. So we will have to deal with them, right? That means we cannot afford conflict because conflict will retard us more than them. So we have to find a way in which we manage a certain hot piece, which will mean balancing resources smartly while continuing to grow. The only way to eventually deal with them is to bridge the gap that we have and bridge the gap economically. And that is where I think our focus should be. So for that, I think these are the 3-4 things that, bullet points that we should do. Of course, under that, there's lots of other things.
I want to add and amplify one point. I feel that a military conflict between India and China would be unwinnable. And China, because it is a bigger economy, would actually get hurt more, not less than us. Okay, it would get hurt more. Because China is not so much a market for us as we are a market for China directly or indirectly. So they would be hit, and they would also be hit in a lot of other places where India has support and economic relations. China would get more badly hit in the event of. The second thing I feel that there are a lot of cultural prejudices on both sides. The absence of a language. Then the state and the government in both the countries do not want to encourage people-to-people relationship beyond a point which they cannot control. For instance, just pause and think sometime, especially young people. No matter what Britain does, what US does, what Australia does, what happens in New Zealand, racism, rivers of blood, virginity tests, people being stopped at the airport, bodies stripped. Now, whatever happens, these are all treated as, transgressions by the state and its agencies. Nowhere, not in the least tiny channel or corner, does it affect movement of people or pursuits of people of education and employment. So, should there be people-to-people relationship? I think one should map the people-to-people relationship that has developed between India and the other countries in the Anglo-American axis and see if we can replicate because this conflict does not apply to other East Asian countries which have a similar culture. With Malaysia, Singapore, this doesn't happen. So, in this case, both countries want to keep these barriers. They are both afraid of their own people intermingling. I feel this fear is also there.
Thank you so much for that. We've run out of time. We're actually over time. I hope this conversation has reduced the height of the Himalayas a little bit, and we both can see a little bit across the mountains. Thank you so much for being patient and bearing with us. Thank you so much, everyone.
I'd like to thank Mr. Ramachandran and Mr. Kewalramani for bringing today's session to BIC. Thank you to the audience for your time and questions. The book from today's session, Beyond Binaries, The World of India and China, is available for purchase and author signing outside. Thank you and have a good night.